All right. Reverend, are we on? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this edition of our talk series. We have titled this African Being Black in Nova Scotia, an African Nova Scotian Table Talk. And this is the very first episode. I want to apologize to everybody for the delay. Trying to get technology working sometimes is quite challenging, even when you put your best to get it in place. But nevertheless, I'm glad that we have a great turnout here, and a lot of people are interested to listening on this conversation. And we have none other than the Reverend Dr. Mutale with us, an elder in our community, an honoree with the Knight of Canada, and many accolades that we can go on. But I don't want to give it all away because that will be part of the conversation we will be having, and we will share in his journey and experience as a Black person being in Nova Scotia, so touching on some of the work that he has done. I'm going to make a couple of people co-hosts so you can admit other people as they come on. And if you are watching live on Facebook, please share the link, copy the link and share it so that other people can watch. And if you feel inclined to join us here in the Zoom call, you're more than welcome. I think we have the Zoom link and the pass code on Facebook so that you can have that one-on-one interaction. So I see that we have Monica in here. I will indulge you, my friend, please. I'll make you a co-host and just so that we can focus on the conversation. And as people come on board, perhaps they can be let in. All right. This group of people. Okay, Reverend, you're a man who needs no introduction, but I'm going to talk a little bit about some of how we've gotten to know each other over the years, working in community. And then I'm going to ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself. So for everybody who's joining, we have the Reverend Dr. Mutale here with us. Many of you know him. If you've been any part of our African Nova Scotian here, you will know who Doctor is. As I said, somebody who needs no introductions. But I personally, just to give you a little background of my own experience with Dr. Mutale, when I first came to Nova Scotia, I got involved in community work, and that is how I met actually Monica, who was, ahead of me at university, and we kind of connected and we worked within the African Students Association, and she was leading that organization. And I say Monica because Monica, for those who don't know, is the daughter of Dr. Mutale. And in the course of that, working on projects on African Night and other things, we got to meet Reverend. And subsequently, when I graduated and went on to do other things back in community, I connected with Reverend on many occasions. So Reverend, it's a real pleasure to have you on here. And thank you for taking the time to come and share with us your experiences and your journey as an African Nova Scotian, being Black in Nova Scotia.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. It's an absolute joy to be able to join you in this conversation.
So why don't we start with this? Just tell us a little bit about where your roots are. You know, back in the language of the motherland, of the mother continent, we say where your umbilical cord was buried, right?
All right. Thank you. That's a good starting point, Mark. My story begins in an African village in northern part of Zambia, where my parents used to live. I'm the son of Gabriel Mutale Chilasa and Jennifer Chewe. They have been wonderful, wonderful parents, real heroes. Their first several years after being married in the early 40s were pretty difficult. And the end result of that is that Dad and a few men in the village decided to go on a long journey, our own version of the Great Trek, from the village to the city. It was a month-long walk. So they walked 700 kilometers, surviving on peanut butter and dried cassava, and pausing to rest overnight wherever they found shelter along the way. Sometimes it was welcoming and very hospitable, at times hostile, and they had to keep moving. So I really have a great sense of gratitude to my father and my mother. Once Dad had settled down in the city, late 40s, he was able to get Mom to travel with other women. The men who traveled were 3, this party was 3, and their wives were able to get on those open trucks that we call lorries in many parts of Africa. That's how they came to the city. And so in 1950, my oldest brother, who is here in Nova Scotia, was born in a tiny grass-thatched Rondavelle. Those are the beginnings of the Mutale family in the city. By the time I came along in 1958, now I'm dating myself, Dad had just started his permanent job. That's the job he was to hold until retirement 20 years later. And so that began to give stability to the family. But those early years were difficult. We were never guaranteed food. From the time I was young to about 10, we were not guaranteed food every day. But you had some sense that maybe at some point food will become available at least once a day. That meant a lot of things that would come together, whether it's Mom being in the bush and quite often accompanied by the then older children in later years, including us younger ones. And so they worked hard to bring together a meal. By the time I was 8 towards 10, Dad's work had progressed and food was better secured. But the start was very difficult. Just want to show you a picture of my mom. The lady in blue there, that's my mom, and those are my siblings. If you can recognize me, I'm to the right of the picture. Let me see, where's my right? Oh, I'm to the left, over here. And those are my siblings. I am one. I am number 4 of 7. So whether you count from the top, I'm number 4. Whether you count from the bottom, I am number 4. So that's the family I grew up in. And I'm fortunate to say my brothers are here in Canada, and the 4 sisters are holding the fort back in Zambia. Those are some of the early years of our family.
Wow. Nicely laid out. And I look at that picture that you just held up, and I could see you at the far right corner, and, you know, young, vibrant, the big smile, came from a very young age, I could tell. So you've talked about a little bit about your journey from the continent and into Canada. Tell us about the early days growing up or being here. What was your experience like? What did you think of Canada?
And thank you, Mark. Before we land in Canada, let me add one more element. My grandfather on mom's side was a World War II veteran. And so deep in the Zambian village, where we are almost 2,000 kilometers from the coast, whether it's Angola, Dar es Salaam, South Africa, we're that far away and yet deep from Central Africa. We were contributing human power to go to the war effort in the Second World War. That war also took away the missionary who was the school teacher in the village where my parents lived. As a result, they could not progress beyond grade 2. Dad had grade 2 and mom had grade 1. So their combined education was grade 3. And yet, that couple, as they were raising us in the city, understood something about the importance of school. You had to go to school. Now think about this. I'm the youngest of the boys. And so in some way, I was like the most fragile. So when we didn't eat the night before, I'm feeling too weak to go to school the next day. And Dad would say, you have to go. Mom would say, let him rest. He's just a kid. And Dad would say, if he doesn't go to school, he'll be hungry his whole life. So he's got to go to school. And so there was no excuse. Off we went, all of us. And it was because my father and mother worked so hard to give us a sense of values and education that the idea once came that we need to think about life outside of Zambia. At the time, we were thinking maybe for 3 to a maximum of 5 years. Zambia was going through a very difficult economic crisis. And what I was not prepared to happen to my children was the experience of food insecurity and the offshoots that poverty tends to bring. That I was determined to avoid. And so the effort to try and find solutions is what led us to Canada when my lovely wife, Monica's mother, along with her sisters, was awarded a scholarship to study at Acadia University, deep in the heart of Nova Scotia. So all my good fortune comes because my wife led the way. I've just been following and trying to keep hold of our cocktails. So that's how we came. And the early years were both interesting as well as frightening. Once you arrive, there is a real sense of I don't know what I am doing. And that included both how to go about finding an apartment in the community or how to go and research so I can write the assignment. In Zambia, our education was based on exams. The British style then, you go to class, you listen to a teacher teach, you write an exam. You have to remember, you have to memorize, yes, and you write an exam. And I was very good at that. I still have a very good memory as a result. But then I came to study in Canada, and it was assignment-based, and the professor gives you an outline, and all the subjects for the semester are assigned to different students. So you go and research and come to present. After a few months, I thought, I don't know what I'm doing here, and I don't know if it's going to work. But we were blessed that our Baptist community really encouraged us. They welcomed us, they embraced us, they started to help us make home. And so those early years started to begin to be promising. And by the first year, we were beginning to feel reasonably well established. But we still had to face major issues of both of us were students and we had 3 kids. And very soon, a 4th one was on the way. How was that going to work out? So it's a real tribute to God's strength and God's grace that 2 young parents with 4 young children came and settled in Nova Scotia, navigating all the complexities of trying to understand who you are in a new land, working with predominantly white folk at the university and community whose curiosity sometimes became quite a pain. You know, they're trying to find out whether you got your clothes at the airport, or what kind of houses did you live in? And so all of that sometimes translated into moments of laughter and fun at people's ignorance, and sometimes frustration that people who should know better didn't know better. But the opportunity to study started to get quite cemented, and both of us got our first degrees in Canada a year and a half later in 1990. We arrived here in 1988.
Wow, thank you. That's quite the journey you just laid out for us, which sets the stage for a lot of the conversation that we are going to be engaging in. So you came with your wife, you were in Arcadia, you were parents to young children, and you've talked to us a little bit about the frustrations sometimes of the interactions that you had with people here, predominantly white, and sometimes they were not frustrating, but were more, funny to say, or created moments of laughter. What about the Black populations of Nova Scotia? When did you first encounter these folk, and what was that engagement like?
Thank you. Thank you. One of the good fortunes we have had in this great dominion is that the Baptist family we belong to has both Black and white. So it didn't take us long to be introduced to the Black community. While in our first year at Acadia, the pastor of Windsor Plains Baptist Church, the Black church on the outskirts of Windsor, was the late Reverend Macpherson Eaton. And he very quickly wanted to introduce us to the Black community where he was pastor, and he did that. So we had a chance to drive to the outskirts of Windsor, to Windsor Plains, and attend the worship service, which took place at that time in mid-afternoon, somewhere 2:30 or 3 o'clock. And I can still remember the excitement of our children saying, "Wow, Dad, you brought us to a good place. The people here look like us. The people here look like us." Try and imagine, those are kids who, context of Acadia, even the daycare was all white. And so now they have a chance to go and see people of African descent in the community of Windsor Plains. They were quite excited. And I had a chance to be able to start preaching there within my first year. And then in the following year, I was able to attend the African United Baptist gathering for the first time. The African United Baptist Association of Nova Scotia is the longest, most durable organization serving people of African descent. The past couple of weeks, we just celebrated 170 years. And so that association has churches scattered all over the province, including 3 Mile Plains, the Baptist church there. And so it gave us an inroad into the community in a very positive way. And very quickly, the folk at Windsor Plains said, okay, there are Black communities where you live. And one was in Aldershot, another one was in Gibson Woods. And so we were looking out for those communities. And in the goodness of God and life's providence, when I graduated from Acadia, I got posted to a church very near the Black community, very near Gibson Woods. And so from the advantage of being pastor in the local community, I started to reach out to the Black community. That was very good because the Black community was very small, but very active, really working hard to give visibility to the community, to try and give direction to young children, and the great elder stateswoman, Deacon Geraldine Browning of Gibson Woods United Baptist Church, became a mentor for my wife Sheena, and was responsible for assisting her to get her first job in the Annapolis Valley at the Kings County Family and Children's Services. So we felt a very strong sense of welcome and very quickly bonded with the community and joined hands to start some important work of forming what is now called the Black Education Committee of Kings. And the constitution that was written to facilitate the registration of BEC, the Black Education Committee of Kings, was significantly was a product of both my work and the lawyer Paul Walter in the Annapolis Valley. You might know Paul since you are a lawyer yourself, Mark. The two of us were responsible for drafting the bulk of that constitution. He's from Antigua, I am from Africa, and here we were in Nova Scotia helping to prepare a constitution. That establishment of BEC made it possible for the Black community to have a day camp for the very first time, a month-long day camp for the very first time in their history. Because with BEC, I had been able to negotiate $500 from the local municipality to be able to fund that day camp. And so that began our involvement in advocacy work and commitment in the Black community.
So the African United Baptist Association, established 1854 by the Reverend Richard Preston, and has a very long-standing history in the Black community here. As you talked about that, I also wanted to note that you just recently became the moderator of the African United Baptist Association. Now, is that by acclamation, or is it, just explain to us a little bit, because people, I think it will be important for the conversation to understand that context, and also to see the evolution. In fact, from Richard Preston, who is also one of the founding fathers of Preston, of the Preston communities. And today, you, Reverend Dr. Mutale, given the history that you've just told us from Zambia to Nova Scotia, your involvement stands in that stead of the great Richard Preston. So can you talk to us a little bit about that experience and how you feel in this moment, holding that mantle of leadership?
Thank you, Mark. Quite a big question there. It's a real privilege and honor to be able to follow in the footsteps of the great men and women who have saved this association. I am so impressed with your grasp of history. All those names you are mentioning are big, important names in the history of African Nova Scotians. And when you talk about David George, the first Black Baptist preacher in North America, to have come here to Nova Scotia and planted a church in Shelburne, Birchtown. And if you have read about the riots of 1784 in Nova Scotia, those were riots against the ministry of David George and the settlement of Black people there, because David George, as a Black minister, was attracting both Black and white and baptizing both groups. And there arose some people there who did not want white people to be mingling with the Black people. And so they rioted, forcing David George out of Shelburne and eventually landing in Bridgetown. And it was David George that led the pilgrimage back to Africa for the people who in 1792 boarded those 15 ships to head back to the motherland. It's a very interesting story of the interconnection of people of African descent in this province. Our people were forcibly plucked away from the great continent. All able-bodied men, women, and children were taken to be used as slaves in the Americas and developing a civilization in which they were not allowed to participate in the blessings of that civilization. So the continent was deprived of the human power to keep developing. Africa was a thriving, developing place. That was interrupted significantly by the introduction of the slave trade. And it started to develop a civilization here that was developing at the expense of Africa. It was as if it was not enough to take all the able-bodied people. They came back for the wealth of Africa in colonialism when they started to exploit Africa's mineral wealth, etc. And so when you talk about those prominent people who were advocates for the freedom of Africans all over the planet, it's a real privilege to be in the association that they started. Richard Preston was the founding father of the association. I was privileged for 10 years from 2002 to 2012 to serve as regional minister for all of the African United Baptist Association churches. So I got to go and on many occasions with my wife and children to some of the remotest part of Nova Scotia, looking for our communities, finding communities, whether they had a church or not. We found them. That's communities as remote as Danvers in the South Shore, or those on the outskirts of Guysborough and Sunnyvale up north. And we were able to find those communities. And there is a community in Goldboro, kind of near Council, Nova Scotia, where a lot of the original settlers were shipped to that coastline and abandoned, essentially, dropped off the ships with no supplies. They were told that a supply ship was coming behind, and the supply ship never came. There was no supply ship that was ever sent. They just brought them and dumped them on the coastlines. So many of them died that winter. They were dropped in Nova Scotia in the dead of winter, and they were buried right on the shores. So their graves began to wash ashore. And at the turn of the century, a project was put in place to rebury those graves. And I had the honor to go and speak at the first anniversary of that commemoration. But here is the point of that encounter. They had symbols and words. The words were Inkombe, which is a Bemba word for messenger. Now just think about it. I'm Bemba by tribe. So that's a Bemba word. I'm sure that it's probably present in other languages in Africa, but it's a Bemba word. The other one was Inkuba, and that's the word for lightning. So, and they had the symbols to go with that. The textbook that they were working with identified them as West African words. And, but in fact, they were words in my language. So just imagine me in rural Nova Scotia, eastern part of Nova Scotia, going through this experience of speaking at the reburial ceremony, the commemoration ceremony of the reburial of the original settlers. And I'm looking at Bemba words. I'm looking at Bemba words. How connected are we? Are we that different? When in fact, even the language made the journey across the ocean to the point that it still survives to this day. So we've had a very rich connection and encounter in the Black community. In 1998, Victoria Road Baptist Church, the Black Baptist Church in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, here where we live, called us to begin ministry there. And so I became pastor on July 1, 1998, and served there for 5 years. It was that ministry at Victoria Road that paved the way for the work I just described as regional minister. And so I really gave tribute to my church family at Victoria Road Baptist. And in doing all of that, one of our major points of effort was, how do we develop the Black community? I was coming from a fairly prosperous white community with a couple of millionaires in the congregation when I got the invitation to come to Victoria Road, a small, struggling Black church in the urban area. What do? Do you leave your prosperity and go? With the background I gave of how difficult the startup of life was, do I leave a prosperous community? I was coach, I was advisor, I was involved with the school, teaching soccer in the community. We built a very strong profile. Do I leave all of that? And ultimately, the decision was yes, let's go and be part of the solution rather than watch the problems from a distance. That's how we came to Victoria Road Baptist Church. And then one day, one of my Sunday school teachers got ill and couldn't come. So I taught the class of 9 kids, grade 3 and above. 4 of the 9 kids could not read. And so it hit me. That's why, fast forward, they are school dropouts. If they can't read now when they should be reading in grade 3 and 4, we've got to do something. And so that's how our academic enhancement project was born. Then we started summer youth employment. I am so proud to be able to say our very first 2 summer youths were Ashley Thomas, who is a lawyer now. You might know Ashley Thomas.
Yes.
She's a thriving lawyer. Her first job was with me at Victoria Road Baptist Church. She and our own daughter, Miriam Mutale, were paired together, and Miriam is a thriving HR specialist. Those were my first 2 summer employment kids in Nova Scotia. Then we started doing a project with Senator Wanda Bernard called From the Ground Up. And that was my request to, what am I going to do about these young women who dropped out of school? I need them to start to chart a new path forward. So we worked together and came up with a project called From the Ground Up. And it was designed to take them along a path that would ultimately lead them to a GED equivalency. I'm so proud to be able to say one of those graduates is an entrepreneur now in Dartmouth. She owns her own and is continuing to thrive. We also did seniors wellness and seniors computer literacy, so they could talk to their grandchildren far away by email and other ways. And so we really got embedded. Some of the results of that is that I've had the opportunity to serve on many different boards of African organizations. I was on the Council for African Canadian Services. I'm still on the Ethno-Cultural Committee for Corrections Canada, and the executive of the African United Baptist Association. All of those opportunities and portfolios combined to place me in a pathway of leadership that was being recognized by the association. So 2 years ago when I was invited to consider becoming vice moderator. And that's the time at which the community votes about who would succeed the moderator when the moderator's term is completed. So 2 years ago, they had that vote. And so I made my start as vice moderator to Deacon David Provo, an outstanding leader from St. Thomas Baptist Church in North Preston. So he just concluded his term 2 weeks ago, and it was my privilege to receive the mantle from him. And the association has had a hand in the development of all of the organizations that serve Black people in Nova Scotia. Directly or indirectly, the association either provided the human power, the advocacy, and the early members of whatever group it was, whether it was Black Educators Association or Black United Front or Health Association of African Nova Scotians, the African United Baptist Association has had a hand. And so have recent immigrants from Africa. What is so interesting to watch is that in the last several decades, going back to the 50s and 60s, many of the movements that have been in place for the development of the well-being of African Nova Scotians have involved Indigenous Black Nova Scotians and recent immigrants from Africa traveling together and working together for the common good. And so that's been an interesting pathway to observe. And so we settled into that mold and continue to participate to see what role we could play in the well-being of all of our people, not just people of African descent recently arrived from Africa, but those who arrived 400 years earlier as well, because we came at different times, but we are still one people.
Thank you, Rev. And you've touched on a lot of things that I want to follow up or engage in some conversation on. So let's talk about the education piece first. So as you went along, to me, I could see a lot of similarities in the experience of early education, the challenges that you had in the early years in Zambia with respect to access to education, access to resources for those to educate yourself. And you talked about the similar experiences that when you were now here serving, you were witnessing from some of the people in community here. And that shows that impact of colonialism, the impact of slavery, as you mentioned, went both ways. It wasn't necessarily only on the community that was taken away, but it was also on the community that remained. Can you talk a little bit about some of this intersectionality or cross-sectionality of this impact? Because even till today, you talked about the fact that it was beyond just the taking away of people, but also that there was the taking away of resources. And when you take away people, you diminish the ability for a community to fully, represent itself and develop itself in using the manpower that it's within it. But when you also take away the resources, after taking the people, then you've even put a particular community at a very disadvantaged position. So can you express for us how you felt in your experience coming from the continent, knowing what had occurred there, and then being in Nova Scotia, seeing your brothers and sisters who had, had come from the continent through their ancestors and the experience that they were having here?
Yeah, that's a big one. That's a very big subject. But that's where I really hope the dialogue continues to grow between both sides of African people, because we've both been deprived and brutalized in severe ways, and the suffering continues to the present time. Let me illustrate it by saying, when the British came to Zambia, their main interest was copper. They found copper, so everything they did there was designed to get to the copper, extract it, and sell it back to Europe. So the railway system or the transportation system, all the infrastructure was geared to extracting and selling copper. So after 70 years of British rule in Zambia, the country became independent in 1964, and there were only exactly 100 Zambians with university education. After 70 years of colonialism, the colonizers who said they came to Africa to educate the savages, they had only educated 100 Zambians after 70 years. Did they come to educate the locals? Clearly no. So as a result, the deprivation that continues to hit Africa today has a very, very long, deep, entrenched history. For example, in the villages where my parents grew up, the British introduced what they called a hard tax. That's the equivalent of property tax here in Nova Scotia.
Mhm.
But you could only pay it in British pounds. What they were trying to do was to force everyone to leave the village to come to work for them on the mines, because that's how you earned the British pounds to pay for your hard tax back in the village. So ultimately, the men have to leave. And with the men leaving the village, the agricultural system breaks down. The thriving production that Africa was experiencing breaks down. The men now are in the cities. After a short while, the families have to join them. The wife and children have to come. So you get the rise of the slums in the cities. You can see the disruption of life as people knew it in the village, and the creation of a different set of circumstances that were not conducive to healthy existence. And so the mortality rate grows up significantly because people do not have access to the right environmental circumstances. Those slums had no running water, they had no sewer services, they had no garbage disposal services, etc. It was not a good existence. Thank God that with time, many slums all over Africa have become beautiful, habitable places. But back then, it was a very, very complicated place to live. That has parallels in the way that people of African descent who are descendant from the Black loyalists and other people that came from down south and settled here. There are real parallels because Africville had a dump place nearby. The community in Guysborough has a dump nearby. Very similar kind of environmental racism was practiced on both sides of the continent to make life complicated for people of African descent. And when they were settled, you observe that now it looks like almost all Black communities are part of the existing city structure. But you go back a few hundred years, they were settled on the outskirts. They were not meant to be part of mainstream. So North Preston is far away from the city. Think back to a time when the city was small and very contained to downtown Dartmouth. And if you wanted to educate your child, you had to get out of the community to educate your child. As a result, many children were not getting the education. They were not dumped on the hills of what is now a thriving community to survive. They were dumped there to die. Every Black community was thrown on the outskirts. The growth of communities now has Black community surrounded to the point that there is a threat to the existence of Black communities. So those are great similarities in terms of how the oppressors imposed a reality and existence on people of African descent on both sides of the continent. And my point there is this: when they plucked people from the continent and created new communities here, that was a work of the oppressor. They were creating a new reality for us on both sides of the continent, but it was an imposed reality. Today, as we relate to one another, we don't have to accept a reality imposed by the oppressor. We have the opportunity to say no to their work and to their evil and say we were going to build thriving communities in which everyone who is a person of African descent, irrespective on which landmass they were raised on, irrespective of what timeline brought them to Nova Scotia, that we are going to build a community of thriving people, of all people of African descent, so that we can then overcome every disadvantage that has been thrown in our pathway. So we have lots of those intersections. We have a common ancestry and we have a shared destiny, because the people who came and occupied the lands in Nova Scotia, and we can never be adequately grateful to them for holding the land on our behalf. All of us, they held the land on our behalf. All of us, we can never be grateful enough. But those ancestors came from Africa. And so we share that ancestry in a very rich way and can form a very rich fabric. Through all of the interwovenness of people from the islands or people from the US, people in Canada, there is such a strong connection. And this last little while, we've been blessed to be to enjoy the company of newcomers from Africa, as well as newcomers from Martinique, an island that the French consider a part of the province of France. It's amazing to see how we relate so well together as people from different parts of the world, because our shared ancestry has given us values that put us in a relationship, even if we have been raised in different places. So today then, we need to think together as a huge, beautiful tapestry that's interwoven, and fight the same fight against whoever the oppressor is, whoever might be trying to deny our children opportunity, whoever might be trying to put us in a small cocoon somewhere and say, you know, you stay back there. You're not one of us, sit at the back of the bus. Whoever is trying to do that, that is the enemy. And so we can collectively band together to unite our strength and fight the good fight to open doors for a better place. I want to introduce one more name we didn't mention among those great names that we mentioned, and it's the great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. Luther King had a dream, and he had of togetherness. I think that his dream is very relevant to our time today.
Thank you so much, Reverend. That was a very powerful response. Let's pick at it a little bit. And folks, if you're just joining us, I am with the Reverend Dr. Mutale, and we're talking about being Black in Nova Scotia, African Nova Scotian Table Talk. We're drawing from his journey from the motherland onto this other continent, and the experiences that he has had while here in encountering brothers and sisters who's were taken as our ancestors from Africa and brought over here, and trying to relate those experiences. You've mentioned the great Martin Luther King. He had a dream. Albeit his dream was that, you know, his sons and daughters would sit together with the sons and daughters of, you know, the white folks who at the time were oppressive, on the table of brotherhood or sisterhood, as you may say. I want to talk about another thing that's similar to that. What about between us as Black folk? You've talked beautifully about our experience, our lived experiences, and how they are very similar in as much as there may be some differences based on where we were born or into what status we were born, and all those things. Would you agree that our lived experiences are more similar than they are different?
Certainly, certainly. And that's why it's important to understand that what unites us is far bigger and far more important than what makes us different. And it's in understanding what unites us that we can find the strength to be able to fight the good fight. When we consider that we have all been deprived, both in the term of participating in the civilization, the success of the civilization, when Black people couldn't buy insurance, or they couldn't buy houses, they couldn't have proper jobs. That's an experience those of us who come in recent years still encounter. We are also denied those opportunities. As a pastor, I can think of a time when I wanted a particular church, two of them, in fact, that are elite churches in our Baptist family. And I felt fully qualified, never even got past the first round of consideration. And somebody who heard that I had been interested in a particular church say to me, "Were you serious, or you were just exploring? Did you get that?" It's like, no, you should not even have been thinking about that. It's the same kind of deprivation that people indigenous to this province say, we as Black people have had so many barriers. That's a barrier we have faced together. Or take when we moved to Kobe Village, now 22 years ago. It was so solidly white. There were very few people of other races. We saw a couple of other Black families. There was one Indian family on our street. That was about it. And people wanted to make such a big statement of, "You're not welcome here." They turned our yard into Dog Walk Park. Those of you who know enough about Nova Scotia and the Africville experience might know a name called Papa Grande. Does anyone know Papa Grande? He used to write poems about the struggle, and he wrote one about turning Africville parking lot into Dog Walk Park. That's where people take their dogs for a walk, etc. And people started to do that. And at one point, I encountered a fairly young child who was walking her dog and making it pause in our yard. And I had to intercept that, something I still do, by the way. But it was so prominent back then, as if the presence of an African family in the community gave them permission to do those kinds of evil misdeeds. It's supposed to be a civilized community. It's supposed to be well-to-do people. It's supposed to be people with values and manners. So what was it that was at work that made them feel, yeah, we can take our dogs and leave our staff, have them leave their stuff on that yard? It's such a vicious act of racism and telling you you don't belong. We encounter all those experiences. It's the same kind of story that I hear from my brothers and sisters indigenous to the province. in terms of their growing up years, and even as adults. The struggle is common. If it's common, can't we have a common approach to the solution so that the fight isn't between us as two sets of African people, but that we are on one side of the fight, working to ensure that the people who created deprivation on the continent, a deprivation whose effects continue to this day, and those who created the deprivation here because they wouldn't give our other ancestors here the opportunity to participate in the economic well-being that was built by our ancestors. The people who were plucked from Africa built the civilization here. And if anyone has free labor, they should be able to develop well. So I find it really difficult and offensive when I hear people talk of Africa as backward. The only reason that Western nations are ahead of Africa is because they got millions of free labor, not cheap labor, free labor to develop this civilization. As that work was going on, inevitably, Africa was suffering a loss. And so we need to ensure that we get a strong sense of togetherness so that we can fight the good fight as one. Will be much more successful.
So Reverend, let's deep into some of the things that you've talked about, because that story, the experiences that you've shared, when I listen to it, I don't see a pathway where we don't work together as one. So why is it very difficult? Why do we still, even up till today, have these tendencies that crop up every now and then within our community, and we find an issue and all of a sudden, you know, there is the other, and we find ways to distinguish ourselves so that we can address that issue rather than seeing the whole. Is that just part of the mindset, the brainwashing of the colonial experience, the slavery experience, or is it inherently just part of our human nature that even where there are many more things that bring about our commonality, just because of the human nature, we still want to be, you know, we still want to move in the direction of individualism, or as a collective, people who identify in a certain specific way.
And I think that it's one of the results. You've identified it accurately. It's one of the results of the dehumanization that we have gone through, that we're left to think that the resources are very limited. And so if we expand the tent of beneficiaries of those resources, that they are going to run out and we will not get our fair share. The reality is that there are a lot of resources. Consider this, that the British government paid out 20 million pounds back then. How many billions of dollars is that in the modern era? They paid out $20 million, 20 million pounds to persuade slave owners to give up the act so that the emancipation could be proclaimed. There's a lot of resources to go around. But it is understandable that when you grow up with deprivation, there is a drive to feel that what I can lay my hands on is only for me, that it takes so much work to be able to find those resources, move forward. So to think about sharing those resources can frighten individuals into feeling, no, there is not enough for all of us. The reality is that together we can build so much more, because united we stand, but divided we fall. So think about it this way, that when we come from Africa, one of the misconceptions is that we are all doing well, because for the most part, we've completed grade 12, we're pursuing either first or second level degrees. And so it looks like there's a swift pathway into the workforce, which creates a feeling among our colleagues that we have an easier, different path. And I often have to say to my colleagues, no, 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 no. What you are looking at are people, a very small, minute number of people compared to people suffering on the continent. I said, even poverty doesn't look the same. Poverty in Nova Scotia means you still have a house, you have a fridge in your house, you have a stove, and you have food for the most part, and your children wear Air Jordans. I said, you know, if you go to Africa and you see poverty, you will not be seeing Air Jordans, you will see starvation. You will see sickness, you will be encountering high death rates. I said, we came to this country and I could not get over how healthy and how long people lived because of a civilization that my ancestors helped to build. People lived for long. Our neighbors were a 60-year-old with her 80-year-old mother. Whenever she came from work, at the end of the day, they walked the streets like two young sisters. They were so healthy, so strong. And I kept saying, oh, why does everybody live so long here? And yet at the children's hospital that was on the road of the theological college I started my training in Zambia, you could count on a single day over 10 motorcades of funerals, funeral processions from the children's hospital. And yet here, the children didn't seem to die. And so the impact is so strong, and that the variation of suffering is noticeable, but it's the same background. So to fight it requires us to be on the same side. Then we can see each other's pain rather than feel like your strength is going to overcome me. We can also become allies. In 2014, I was part of an Association of Black Social Workers major conference. They have them every few years. And I was doing a workshop on overcoming the divide within the Black communities. And I was trying to make the case for togetherness, that let's do this work together. And so there was this very intense moment when I was asking the question. So brothers and sisters, I had 14 people in my group, every one of them Indigenous Black Nova Scotian. I said, brothers and sisters, I want to know, are we allies or are we enemies? They were able to say we are not enemies, but could not say we are allies. So we are not yet seen as allies. And I think that's part of the problem. We've been lumped almost on the other side together with the oppressor, even though we look the same. But we come and it looks like we have advantages over Indigenous Black Nova Scotians. And that's only because they're seeing a small part of the African population. Thankfully, things have changed a lot in that a lot of other levels of African migrants have come, whether they are refugees or others that are coming, not necessarily starting with university education, but they are starting at a much lower level. That has given a different opportunity to see people from Africa in a different light. It just needs to come much more to the forefront so that it becomes included in the discussion and the thoughts that are going around in terms of how we access the education and pave the pathway for our children. And let me say this to round off that thought. Education was the key for my parents. Education will always be the key to pave the way. And so I gave those examples of starting on academic enhancement because I wanted the children to read so they can thrive in class. I gave the example of two young girls, two teenagers who were learning to work in the church summer employment program, but it was one from the indigenous Black community, one from the immigrant community, building them up together. Both of them have gone on to take full opportunities. We need to invest in educating all of our communities, whether they are recent immigrants or those from the 52 who are descended from the 52 land-based communities in Nova Scotia. They are all our children together. And there are enough resources in this land, in this province, to be able to make a serious dent in the educational difference that still shows up in Black communities.
Very well said. We need to educate ourselves on the history of our ancestors who came here a long time ago. Equally, the descendants need to educate themselves about the people who have been coming over the years, because we have a lot in common. Now, on that thought, I wanted to ask this because we're talking really here about quantifying historical wrongs. So can we really quantify historical wrongs? And I ask that question because of what you have said in your last comment, but specifically because of this thought. Every society has people with different statuses, and we can interrogate the cause for that, but that is the way it is. We know about Irish immigrants who came to Canada and were treated differently because they were not quote unquote, although they were white, but they were seen as the other. We know about Italians who were treated differently. And so the story goes on. And so, if we say the British or say the French were the first year, they had differences with the British who came immediately after, and they saw each as the other. And even within these societies, you still had a difference in status, right? So let's take, for example, even within the community of slaves, you still had certain preferential treatment. I mean, in Nova Scotia, if we're talking about being Black in Nova Scotia, they talk about indentured servitude. There were people who were indentured servants. At the same time, you had people who were still slaves, but perhaps the indentured servants had a higher status than those who were considered slaves. And yet there were others who might have received different favors based on what they were doing. So inherently, our society, and a lot of it, the work of the oppressor, has always been stratified to benefit the oppressor. And when people buy into that sort of stratification, however it comes, it only serves to benefit the oppressors. And so I say that to ask this question. When we think about our lived experiences as Black folk, should we be looking at the big picture of our Black experience, or should we be looking at our collective Black experience, or should we be assessing it from the perspective of our experience based on the status that we perhaps have within that collective Black community?
Interesting question, Mark. There is a sense in which that any advantage, any people group have, they seek to exert that advantage on others. And that in part is what we saw with both slavery and colonization, that people groups or racial groups that had a particular advantage, whether because they had arms or they were further steps ahead in the development process, they had advantages before them that they chose to use against other people who were a little bit behind in the process of development. It's one of the saddest things for me at the human level, at the purely human level, that human beings think that way, that if I have an advantage, I should make someone else suffer because I have this advantage. So I'm going to deprive or punish another group of people because in my view, they are less than who I am. It's one of the very saddest experiences at a basic human level. That's what slavery did. That's what colonization did. That's what neocolonialism is still doing worldwide. That's why I try so hard to ensure that we don't fall in the same trap as people of African descent from wherever we have come from, that we don't take whatever advantage we have to use it for someone else's disadvantage. We need to consider that strength, God's endowment in us for the betterment of the good of everyone. And so there is a place for looking at localized needs, for sure. We all live in local communities. That's why you have, municipalities that look at local issues. You have provinces that look at provincial issues, and you have federal governments that look at the national issues. There's always a place for all of those issues to be looked at from both the micro perspective as well as the larger macro perspective. So I think that it's a dual front. What we have seen in the indigenous Black community in Nova Scotia is an illustration of that while fighting for local rights here, there has been a great effort to connect with the homeland in Africa. So there are projects like Connecting to Africa. There are other many different kinds of initiatives right now linking African Nova Scotians with the great continent. Sierra Leone, Ghana are primary beneficiaries of those efforts, but others have been to Zambia as well, in the south central part of the continent and many other places, because there is still a place for the larger collective. There is still a place for the total picture of us as a people together on one side fighting the good fight. If we don't succeed to have that sense of unity, we will create factions in our midst that are not going to be an advantage. They will create a gap that the oppressor can take advantage of and keep us divided. When Zambia became independent, there are 72 tribes in Zambia, and each tribe was kind of trying to pull its weight. Okay, the country is getting independent. How are we going to position ourselves as a tribe to have maximum advantage in the new government? And very wisely, the first president of the Republic of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda, came up with the slogan, "One Zambia, One Nation." And he created a system of representation so that every tribe was represented in government in one form or another. Every tribe. He went about singing "One Zambia, One Nation" and working for the realization of that dream. He was extremely successful, and to this day, Zambia is one of the most peaceful countries, not just in Africa, but all over the world. We have a lot to teach about democracy to everyone from many parts of Africa, including Zambia. But it was because he was successful in uniting 72 tribes. And I joke with my colleagues here in Canada, I say, you talk about French and English and you think there is a problem. That's two. We had 70 plus, and yet he created a strong sense of togetherness that we are one Zambia and one nation, battling whatever the ills the country faces collectively. And it's in that collective dream that our individual well-being is taken care of. If we grow to a point where we take the welfare of all people of African descent together as one dream, as the great Dr. Martin Luther King dreamed, we will find that our individual welfare is taken care of as well. But if we isolate and say, no, 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 we are people from Africa, our friends are not from Africa, they are from here, so we are going to chart our own path, we are preparing for a downfall at some point sooner or later, and that is not a recommended pathway, and vice versa. If our colleagues that are descended from the 52 land-based communities say, oh, no, 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 you didn't take part in the building of these communities and holding the fort here, so you're not one of us, sit at the back of the bus. That is a faulty position. And we need to together come to a collective understanding. Our struggle is one, and our ancestry is shared, and our destiny can be common. So we can journey together, and in doing so, the welfare of everyone would be covered.
Thank you very much, Reverend. For everybody listening, again, I just want to say these are some very deep and important conversations. There is a lot to cover. That's why we're taking some latitude here with the time. We will start to wrap up, but remember, this is only episode 1 of the series. We intend to continue to have this conversation and to dig deeper. There is a lot to cover, and Reverend is giving us a very, very important and good foundational introduction, covering the scope of our struggle, the challenges, the opportunities, and how we have to navigate our own differences. Because yes, we do have differences in our community, but the sum of our commonality are more greater than the differences that exist. And therefore, it's a matter of a choice. How do we want to be as a people? Do we want to focus on our common ancestry and the things that bring us together? Or are we going to pay more attention to the things that seemingly are our differences? Reverend, how do we begin to build this interconnectedness? Because as you've said, we are a diverse people. And as we've recognized, part of it is the direct creation of the oppressor's tool, which is colonialism and slavery. And as much as we want to overcome those things, the reality is that those things exist and they are going to exist for some time. But it is up to us how we begin to change that trajectory and how we begin to orientate and mentor the new generation, the younger generation, so that they don't have as much of a gap as we have to overcome to bring ourselves together. So what are some of the tools that you would recommend? What are some of the things that we need to be doing? We've talked about education. We need to educate ourselves about each other's stories, lived experiences, histories. You just talked about the fact that we have to really work together. So that seems to me like we're talking about we need to talk to each other a lot more. So can you expand a little bit on that point? How do we talk to each other, not just for the sake of talking, or not just when there is an issue to be talked about, but for the sake of building that common purpose, understanding?
Thank you, Mark. I think the first and probably most important element for me is building relationships. It is so important, relationships with people from all sectors of society and community. It's in relationships that we create new pathways and networks. For example, I gave the day camp we had for Black children way back in the 90s. But the results of that happened because I had a network and relationships of Black activists on one hand and white power holders on the other hand. By being a member of a Baptist church, I got to know who the decision makers were at the Human Resources Department, the current, it's Service Canada now. It was then called Human Resources Department. I got to know who those decision makers were. And by taking advantage of my network in the Caucasian community, I could say to somebody, okay, I need you to go and introduce me to so-and-so. And so we went. I got introduced to some of those key stakeholders. In that small Kentville New Miners community where our first parish was located, I got to meet all of the power brokers. I got to meet the principals, the funeral directors, the police superintendent, the community psychologist, because the position of minister in the community gave me access to all those individuals. And so I started to build relationships. And in building those relationships, I was accumulating, for lack of a better word, political capital to be able to utilize when I needed it. Each one of us has a network of people we can look around. They may be our colleagues at work. They may be our bosses even, or they may be our comrades in the community groups we belong to, Rotary or Lions Club, Boy Scouts, whatever those groups are where we interact with other members of society. Let's build relationships. Let's help them to understand we're human beings with feelings and issues and causes like them. Pastoring that first parish of people who had never been in the presence of a Black person, and they were saying, we didn't know that the things that we care for are the same things that matter to you. We can see you love your children, you really care for your wife, etc. Because there was this misunderstanding that had been perpetuated. Africans were less than ideal human beings and could be mistreated and misunderstood. Those relationships take away that negative characterization. They replace it with a sense of common humanity that give us friendships that will work in the long run and help us to develop more allies. Then as you have opportunity to be active in whatever form the activism needs to take place in your local neighborhood, or in your school parent teachers association, or in your workplace, even in the political arena, be active. Bring the African voice to the table so that sooner rather than later, we are at the decision-making tables. Because when we are not at the tables, our voice is often not heard. I will tell you a story that I ran into in the 90s when I was sourcing money for those projects I described earlier. A white Baptist deacon who was a manager in one of those departments and a real ally, a friend of the Black community. He was trying hard to fund the Black communities. His colleagues were telling him that Black people constituted 2% of the population, and that's all the amount of money they were prepared to allocate for the development of Black communities was 2%. This was in the 90s. So the ill will that goes on behind the scenes is so entrenched, it is still there. But we can break it down if we have good networks and relationships with a wide variety of people. So let's take advantage of whatever networks we have. If you have belonging to a church or another club, get to know some of those people and work your way to a position where when you need support, when you need help, they can be your advocates. That includes how we go about solving the problems we are having now within the Black communities. You mentioned how we need to talk to each other. And again, the networks of relationships are going to be critical in being able to have those conversations. Because we do have allies, we do have people who see the problem the way that we see it, that it's our common problem. But we need to expand that network of friendships and relationships so that we gain access all the way to the top if necessary. In our pathway of settling in Canada, we have seen a high-powered representation on our behalf because of those networks. When we were first threatened with immigration issues, because it was quite complicated back then to try and settle down as a visitor or student in Canada, not like now when the opportunity is open for everyone. Back then it was very hard. It was a combination of the Acadia University president and the Baptist Convention that paved the way for us to be able to stay in Nova Scotia. Just try and get a grip of that right now. It was a combination of the work of the Acadia University president, the then Dr. Jim Perkin, and the Baptist Convention, whose advocacy and intervention made it possible for us to stay. But what if we didn't have those networks? What if we didn't have those relationships? We may not be here talking together.
Thank you, Reverend. As we wind down, I just want to thank our audience and let them know that we will continue this conversation with Reverend Mutale. He has a lot to share with us as an elder in the community. There are some pressing matters that we want to discuss and have him weigh in on those matters. But today, on this episode 1, we wanted to provide an overview of the kinds of conversations that we will be having under this series, Being Black in Nova Scotia, the African Nova Scotian Table Talk. And I see there are a lot of colleagues of mine, mentors, other people who are in the Zoom. And we would want to say that this is an opportunity for all of us to be able to share those stories. When we talk about education, we talk about talking to each other. You know, certainly this platform is open for us to come on as a panel or as a guest, as Reverend is here today, and let us talk about these issues and reason together and find the best ways in which we can collectively advocate for us. So Reverend, I want to thank you so much, but I'm also letting our audience know that this is not all of the conversation between me and you. This was just laying a foundation for what is to come. There are some hard issues that we haven't gotten into, rightfully so. We wanted to set the stage for those kinds of conversations and have a context so that we were not just here discussing hard issues. And as Reverend said, we are human beings first. And so sometimes, you know, we tap into these things through our emotions. And so I think, Reverend, you have helped us set a great stage for these conversations. And it will be very, very much lovely to have you back, and so that we can pick at some of the most pressing issues that are affecting Black folk in Nova Scotia and sharing those experiences. I just want to open up. If anybody has any question, because of the time, we're going to limit it to at least 3 for Reverend. If you have a question, please just put up your hand using the hand raise button, and then we'll call on you to ask the question. Reverend, it looks like you wanted to say something.
And that's all right. What you've just said is what I was hoping for, that there might be questions around the room. And while we wait for question number 1 to come, I just wanted to say that thank you so very much, Mark. This is just a delightful opportunity to begin having a conversation, a very important conversation. And last month, we clocked 35 years in Canada, 35 years. And 30 plus of those, we've been invested in issues facing Black people in Nova Scotia. And we have taken residence in Nova Scotia. We are Africans from Africa, resident in Nova Scotia. And so we have felt a really strong part of the African Nova Scotia fabric and are fully invested in the work that goes on in the communities and at all levels. And it's very, very inspiring to see such a strong cast of interest from our community, because that, I think, has been one of the major missing elements, that when we come, we're so busy trying to settle down. We have no time for politics. We don't have time to understand what's happening in the community and how we can get involved. We're busy studying or doing 2 or 3 jobs in order to make ends meet and survive in the new land. But now we are reaching a point where we understand that part of that survival is our collective interest and collective well-being as a people together with brothers and sisters indigenous to the province.
Thank you. I'm just looking at the list. I don't see any hands up yet. So I think we have done well in the foundation. There are no questions at this stage, but I bet you in subsequent conversations, once we start to get to the meat of stuff, I'm sure that people would want to weigh in, and certainly that's what we want. Rev, I don't know if you have any final words for this particular episode, but please give us some last words to wrap up this particular episode.
Thank you. I go back to the great Dr. Martin Luther King and his dream. When he dreamed in 1963, I doubt he felt that within 40 years, America would see the first Black president. He was assassinated in 1968. Exactly 40 years later, Barack Obama became president of the United States. I doubt that given the conditions, the difficult, sweltering conditions of oppression and marginalization in the 60s and before, that dream he might have seen coming true so quickly. But he did his part. He did his work, paid with his life for it. And much sooner than I think he might ever have hoped to see, things began to move in the United States of America. I have a dream too, that one day we as people of African descent will see our common ancestry and shared destiny and be able to say that it doesn't matter which landmass we were raised on, that we are one people. And I want to add this, that the primary strength that Martin Luther King Jr. had was his faith in God. And most of us come from Africa with a faith in God. If you came like that, hold on to your faith. I know it is hard in this land to hold on to the faith. But if you came from Africa with a faith, in whatever form you practice your faith, I want to encourage you, hold on to that faith, because it was a big part of what fueled the dream in Dr. Martin Luther King's quest for justice. And if he could dream for a table of fellowship for former slave owners and former slaves, we surely can dream of a common ancestry, a common destiny, and a common table in our day and time. I think there was a hand from 2 hands now.
I think those people are raising their hands in praise and affirmation for what you have reaffirmed in terms of holding on to our faith. But if their hands were up for questions, then certainly, but I think that's what the reaction was. Yeah. Thank you so much to all of our guests, to everybody who has turned up. Thank you so much for showing up and for spending this time with us. I know that it's a busy time of the year, but I really want to appreciate you for taking the time to come. And I want to encourage you to come again, and not just to come, but to also be an active participant in the conversation, because we intend to cover a lot of very crucial things that you have experienced in your life, in your own experience as Black people or people of African descent, in Nova Scotia, we want to share, and we want you to be able to contribute in sharing your experiences so that we can start to build on what has been done to bring us together, to forge a common path, to stand together as one, and to ensure that no form of oppression, no form of oppression should be the reason why we fight against each other. We should be fighting against oppression, not letting oppression divide us. So thank you all. Have a great evening. And to those who are getting to school tomorrow, I wish you a great start of the school year, both to the teachers and to the students. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone.